The tension in the chamber was palpable as the clerk began to report the title of House Joint Resolution 72, a legislative move that would ultimately serve as a litmus test for the Republican Party's alignment with the president's aggressive economic strategies, particularly regarding the declared national emergency from February 1st, 2025. The air was thick with political calculation as members prepared to record their votes by electronic device, knowing that the outcome would reverberate far beyond the walls of the Capitol. The stakes had been set incredibly high by the president's earlier warnings of harsh consequences for those within his own party who dared to defy his stance on the Canada tariffs, a move that had already fractured the traditional conservative consensus on free trade and diplomatic relations with northern neighbors. As the 5-minute voting window closed, the numbers flashed on the board, revealing a deeply divided House with the yeas at 219 and the nays at 211, a razor-thin margin that underscored the fragility of the current political coalition. The passage of the joint resolution was not just a procedural victory, but a signal that the legislative branch was still wrestling with the executive's use of emergency powers to drive economic policy. The motion to reconsider was laid on the table, effectively sealing the vote and setting the stage for the next phase of this escalating political drama. This domestic volatility, however, was merely the backdrop for a much broader geopolitical shift that was taking place simultaneously as the focus of the news cycle pivoted from the dry procedural drama of Washington to the visceral energy of international protests. While the politicians in Washington were counting votes, the streets of Toronto were echoing with the chants of a diaspora desperate for change. The rallying cry was not about tariffs or trade wars, but about the fundamental freedom of Iran from the Islamic regime. These were not just isolated pockets of discontent, but represented a significant shift in the global mood where calls for Donald Trump to take decisive action were becoming louder and more organized. The chants of act now coming from the rallies were a direct appeal to American power, reflecting a deep-seated frustration with the status quo and a willingness to embrace drastic measures to upend a regime that has held power for over 4 decades. This growing clamor for intervention raises a complex question about efficacy and consequences. As Deakin University professor Greg Barton noted in his analysis, the issue is not whether American action would be successful in destabilizing the regime, because almost any significant external pressure is likely to shake the foundations of the current power structure. The true dilemma lies in the vacuum that follows destabilization. The vulnerability of the regime is apparent, but the path to a functioning open society is obscured by the fog of potential chaos. It is difficult to envision a seamless transition to the kind of democratic governance that protesters dream of, and the history of the region is littered with examples of power vacuums being filled by forces even more oppressive or chaotic than the ones they replaced. We must understand the gravity of the human cost that has already been paid. Tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of brave protesters have taken to the streets, facing real risks to their lives. The estimated death toll is staggering, with many thousands killed, possibly representing the worst loss of life to protesters since the formation of the Islamic Republic during the Revolution of 1979. This level of bloodshed speaks to a desperation that has fundamentally altered the calculus of the Iranian people. Historically, the idea of U.S. intervention would have been rejected by the populace and branded as imperialist overreach, a narrative that the regime has successfully cultivated for years. However, the dynamic has shifted dramatically. People are now so desperate that they are prepared to gamble on U.S. intervention. The sentiment on the ground has moved to a place where many are saying, bring it on, essentially asking for any external shock that could break the deadlock and bring about change. This is a profound departure from historical norms and highlights the severity of the internal crisis. The protesters are aware of the risks, yet they view the current status quo as so intolerable that the uncertainty of intervention is preferable to the certainty of continued oppression. This brings us back to the central dilemma articulated by security analysts, which is that once the process of destabilization starts, there is no guarantee of what replaces the current awful regime. It is possibly something better, but there is no clear path. And that uncertainty hangs heavy over every policy decision made in Washington. The horror of the crackdown is not abstract statistics, but is composed of individual tragedies and rare moments of reprieve that further complicate the narrative. We saw this in the case of the Iranian protester Sultani, whose family had been told he faced the death penalty, only for him to be released on bail just days after the United States issued a warning regarding his potential execution. The release of this 26-year-old following a bail payment of around $12,000 after being arrested for propaganda against the state and national security offenses offers a glimpse into the mechanics of pressure. It suggests that the regime, despite its bluster and claims of sovereignty, is not entirely immune to external warnings. This incident demonstrates that pressure from the United States does make a quantifiable difference, but it is a double-edged sword. The regime controls the information landscape within Iran, maintaining a stranglehold on the internet and possessing vast disinformation capabilities. They actively propagate the narrative that all protesters are driven by foreign agents, specifically by the United States and Israel. Therefore, when the U.S. president publicly states that America stands with the protesters, it inadvertently reinforces the regime's propaganda that the unrest is manufactured from abroad rather than being an organic uprising of a dissatisfied people. Yet, despite this narrative trap, the release of prisoners amidst a backdrop of summary executions shows that U.S. power still holds sway. The critical challenge now facing policymakers is how to leverage that power to maximize humanitarian good without triggering a catastrophic collapse or playing into the hands of hardliners who thrive on conflict with the West. The sheer scale of the disruption we are witnessing in the North American economy is not merely a byproduct of failed negotiations, but a direct result of a fundamental miscalculation regarding the leverage the United States holds over its closest neighbors. When Mark Carney walked out of that room, it wasn't just a diplomatic snub, it was a signal that the era of asymmetrical deference was over. For years, the assumption in Washington has been that Canada and Mexico would ultimately bend the knee because their economies are so inextricably linked to the American consumer market. That assumption, however, failed to account for the political reality that sovereignty often trumps economics, especially when leaders feel backed into a corner by what they perceive as extortion rather than negotiation. The collapse of the USMCA framework is not an isolated event, but a domino that topples a decades-long structure of integrated supply chains, particularly in the automotive sector, where parts cross the border sometimes 7 or 8 times before a vehicle is finished. This isn't just about milk or lumber anymore. we are talking about a complete decoupling of the North American manufacturing base. The immediate consequence of the tariff snapback, which essentially reverts trade relations to pre-NAFTA levels, is a massive spike in production costs that will inevitably be passed down to the consumer. But beyond the price at the pump or the sticker on a new car, there is a deeper structural damage being done. The certainty that businesses need to invest capital has evaporated. If you are a manufacturer in Ohio or Ontario, you are now looking at a landscape where the rules of the game can change with a single tweet or a sudden executive order, and that kind of volatility is poison for long-term economic growth. The irony is palpable because the very people these tariffs were supposedly designed to protect the working class manufacturing base are the ones most vulnerable to the fallout. When we look at the specific threats levied against Republicans who dared to vote against the president's national emergency declaration, we see a disturbing weaponization of party loyalty over legislative duty. The phrase harsh consequences wasn't just bluster, it was a promise of primary challenges, funding cuts, and public humiliation. This is how you enforce discipline in a party that has lost its ideological moorings and replaced them with a cult of personality. The members who voted yea on the resolution to terminate the emergency weren't just voting on trade policy, they were voting on the separation of powers. They were asserting that the Constitution grants Congress the power of the purse and the authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations, not the executive branch. By invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, to impose tariffs, the president is essentially bypassing the legislative process to enact tax policy by fiat. This is a dangerous precedent that goes far beyond any single trade deal because it effectively renders Congress a bystander in the management of the national economy. The reaction from the markets has been swift and brutal. The uncertainty surrounding the USMCA collapse has triggered a sell-off in equities, particularly in sectors with high exposure to cross-border trade. But the financial markets are just a leading indicator of the broader economic pain to come. We are likely to see significant job losses in the logistics and transportation sectors as the volume of cross-border trade plummeted. The trucking industry, which relies heavily on the free flow of goods between the three nations, is facing an existential crisis. Drivers are sitting idle at border crossings that have become choke points, not because of security concerns, but because of bureaucratic red tape and new tariff inspections. This friction adds cost and time to every transaction, making North American goods less competitive on the global stage. Mark Carney's strategy appears to be a calculated gamble that Canada can weather the storm by diversifying its trade partnerships and leaning into its vast natural resources. By refusing to capitulate to the demand for 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, Carney is effectively saying that Canada will not be a vassal state in America's economic war with China. This stance, while risky, plays well domestically for Carney, who can frame the standoff as a defense of Canadian sovereignty. However, the economic reality is that diversifying away from a partner that absorbs 75% of your exports is a generational project, not something you can achieve in a few fiscal quarters. The pain in the Canadian economy will be acute and immediate, but the political calculation is that the blame will fall squarely on the unpredictable nature of the American administration rather than on Ottawa's intransigence. Meanwhile, back in Washington, the focus remains on the internal purge within the GOP. The vote count on the joint resolution was a wake-up call for the leadership. A margin of 8 votes is terrified in a House this divided. It means that the president's grip on the caucus is slipping, not because his popularity with the base has waned, but because the practical consequences of his policies are starting to bite in the districts of vulnerable members. You have representatives from agricultural districts seeing commodity prices tank as retaliatory tariffs hit American farmers. You have members from manufacturing districts hearing from local business owners who can't get the parts they need to keep their factories running. This grassroots pressure is creating a fissure between the ideological loyalists and the pragmatic survivalists within the party. The administration's response has been to double down on the rhetoric of betrayal. The narrative being spun is that anyone who opposes the tariffs is effectively siding with foreign adversaries against American workers. This binary us versus them framing is effective at rallying the base, but it does nothing to solve the underlying economic crisis. In fact, it exacerbates it by making any kind of compromise impossible. You cannot negotiate a nuanced trade deal when you have painted your own negotiating partners as enemies of the state. The tragedy here is that there were legitimate grievances to be addressed regarding the USMCA. The rules of origin for automobiles needed updating, and there were valid concerns about labor standards enforcement. But instead of using the review clause to fine-tune the agreement, the administration chose to blow it up entirely in pursuit of a protectionist fantasy that has been debunked by history time and time again. As we look ahead to the implementation phase of these new tariffs, we must consider the legal challenges that are sure to follow. The business community, which has generally been supportive of the administration's deregulation agenda, is now mobilizing its legal armies to challenge the use of emergency powers for trade purposes. The courts have generally been deferential to the executive on matters of national security, but the argument that Canadian steel or Mexican avocados represent a national security threat is legally tenuous at best. We are likely to see injunctions and protracted litigation that will keep the trade landscape in a state of limbo for months, if not years. This legal uncertainty only adds to the economic drag as businesses hoard cash rather than investing in expansion or hiring. The geopolitical ramifications are equally severe. By alienating its two closest neighbors, the United States is effectively isolating itself in its own hemisphere. This creates a strategic opening for China to deepen its economic ties with Latin America and even Canada. We are already seeing signs of this with increased Chinese investment in Mexican infrastructure and renewed talks about free trade agreements with other Pacific Rim nations that exclude the United States. The collapse of North American unity is a strategic gift to Beijing, which has long sought to fracture the Western alliance system. It allows China to position itself as the champion of free trade and multilateralism, a role that the United States has abdicated. Furthermore, the rhetoric of harsh consequences for dissenters creates a chilling effect that stifles any meaningful policy debate. When elected officials are afraid to speak their minds for fear of political retribution, we lose the collective wisdom that is supposed to guide our democracy. The Republican Party, which once prided itself on being the party of free markets and individual liberty, has become the party of protectionism and executive overreach. This transformation has been happening gradually, but the vote on the emergency resolution marks a definitive turning point. It draws a line in the sand that forces every member to choose between their principles and their political survival. The situation is further complicated by the looming midterm elections. Vulnerable Republicans in swing districts are caught in a pincer movement. On one side, they have the primary voters who demand absolute loyalty to the president's agenda. On the other side, they have general election voters who are seeing the cost of living rise and their local economies suffer. Navigating this minefield requires a level of political dexterity that few possess. The result is likely to be a chaotic election cycle where trade policy becomes a central wedge issue not just between the parties, but within them. Ultimately, what we are witnessing is the dismantling of the post-war economic order that the United States built and sustained for 70 years. That order was based on the premise that economic integration fosters peace and prosperity. By tearing up that social contract, we are entering a new era of zero-sum economics, where every nation is an island and every trade deal is a battleground. The costs of this shift will be measured not just in dollars and cents, but in lost opportunities and diminished influence. The United States cannot lead the world if it cannot even lead its own continent. And as long as we continue to govern by threat and ultimatum rather than by consensus and cooperation, we will continue to see our global standing erode. The threats of harsh consequences for the 211 Republicans who defied the president are not empty rhetoric. They are the opening salvo of a civil war within the GOP that will likely redefine the party for a generation. We are already seeing the machinery of the MAGA movement turning its sights on these dissenters with a precision and ferocity that is usually reserved for Democrats. The president's inner circle has reportedly drawn up lists of primary challengers for every single member who voted to terminate the national emergency declaration. This is not how a healthy political party operates in a representative democracy. This is how a crime family enforces discipline. The message is clear: loyalty to the leader supersedes fidelity to the Constitution or the economic interests of one's constituents. These members, many of whom are staunch conservatives with voting records that would have been considered exemplary 5 years ago, are now being branded as traitors simply for believing that the executive branch should not have the unilateral power to levy taxes on American allies under the guise of national security. The irony is that while the administration is busy purging its own ranks for insufficient fealty, the true national security threats are multiplying abroad. The juxtaposition of the chaos in Tehran with the self-inflicted wounds of the North American trade war paints a picture of a superpower that has lost its strategic bearings. We have an administration that is willing to destabilize the economies of Canada and Mexico, our two biggest trading partners and closest allies, over a dispute about electric vehicles, while simultaneously navigating a potential regime collapse in Iran. This erratic approach to statecraft, where allies are treated like adversaries and foreign policy is conducted via ultimatum, weakens the United States precisely when it needs to be strongest. If the goal is to confront China or contain a nuclear Iran, you need a united North American front, not a fractured continent where Ottawa and Mexico City are looking for ways to bypass Washington entirely. The legal architecture that supports this governance by emergency decree is profoundly fragile. The National Emergencies Act was never intended to be a loophole for presidents to bypass Congress whenever they couldn't get their legislative agenda passed. By invoking IEPA to impose tariffs on Canada, the president is stretching the definition of a national emergency to its breaking point. If a trade dispute with a friendly neighbor constitutes a national emergency, then the term has lost all meaning. This sets a precedent that will inevitably be abused by future presidents of both parties. Imagine a Democratic president declaring a national emergency on climate change to ban the export of fossil fuels, or on gun violence to seize firearms. The Republicans cheering on this abuse of power today are handing a loaded weapon to their political opponents of tomorrow, and they seem completely oblivious to the long-term damage they are doing to the constitutional order. We are witnessing the final stages of the Republican Party's transformation from a party of ideas into a party of one man's grievances. The traditional pillars of conservatism, free trade, limited government, the rule of law, and strong alliances have all been abandoned in favor of a populist nationalism that is as incoherent as it is destructive. The 211 members who voted yea on the resolution were trying to salvage some remnant of that old philosophy, but they are fighting a losing battle against a base that has been conditioned to view any dissent as betrayal. The harsh consequences promised by the president will likely result in a Congress that is even more compliant, even more radical, and even less capable of governing. We are moving toward a parliamentary style of politics where the legislative branch is merely a rubber stamp for the executive, but without the mechanisms of accountability that exist in a true parliamentary system. Ultimately, this is a tragedy of leadership. The United States has the economic and military power to shape the 21st century, but it lacks the political maturity to wield it effectively. We are squandering our inheritance on petty trade wars and internal purges while the rest of the world moves on without us. The collapse of the USMCA and the potential destabilization of the Iranian regime are just two sides of the same coin, a world in flux where American leadership is either absent or actively harmful. If the Republican Party cannot find the courage to stand up for the Constitution against the whims of a demagogue, then it deserves to be consigned to the ash heap of history. But the real cost will be borne by the American people, who will wake up one day to find that their republic has been hollowed out from within, leaving behind only the shell of democracy and the reality of authoritarianism.